Annaka Harris, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be back. Great to see you.
It's great
always.
to see. It's always great. Yes, absolutely. Most of our communication is trading cat pictures via text.
I was just going to mention that too. That's funny. I usually see your cat, not you.
All right. So I just love this work. I've been, as you know, a fan and follower of your work for many, many years. And I really love this new project, this audiobook. Is that the right way to describe it? Audiobook?
Yeah, I mean, it's a new genre, really. So we're calling it an audio documentary. It really, that's the most natural term that fits it best. It really is a documentary. It's almost as if you were watching a documentary with the video turned off. So yeah, I mean, I'm narrating the documentary, and then I have all the people I interviewed, and it follows my path of asking all of these questions and where they led me and who they led me to speak to. And so I'm kind of telling this story of a path I took over the course of 4 or 5 years.
And that's really palpable in listening to it. And I blurbed it, and one of the things I was saying is that, it has the feel of a mystery, kind of a rollicking, good time scientific mystery, and it really does tie to how we live our lives and how we can do that better and organize our mind and train our mind. So it's kind of a center of the bullseye for my interest.
That's really wonderful to hear, because that was the intention. And yeah, when you spend that long on a project, you just don't know. You get lost in it and you don't know, how it will be received. But that was the intention. So that's wonderful to hear. Yeah.
Before we get to the specific kind of mind-bending question that you're chasing in the audio doc.
Yeah.
Let me just ask a broader question. What is consciousness? Why does it matter? Why should I care what consciousness is?
That's a great question to start with. So people use the word in a variety of ways. And many people, when they use the word consciousness, think about human consciousness. They think about very complex brain processing, self-awareness, complex thought. But I'm using the term in the most basic sense. And so the thing that I am so fascinated by, and that is still completely mysterious to the sciences, is just the fact of felt experience. And so if you can imagine the most minimal felt experience in an insect or a worm, if there's some feeling of moving through the dirt, if there's some sensation, when a bee is flapping its wings, obviously we don't think a bee is self-aware or thinking any thoughts, or, it's a very simple system, but we can imagine it's possible that there's an experience from the inside of being that system. And so the mystery and the thing that I love thinking about, and that I hope we learn more about in the future, is how is it that this universe seems to be composed of all this non-conscious matter, but in some cases this matter gets arranged in a way that the matter itself has an experience from the inside of being that matter. So if you think of what it's like for us to see the color green, green, the seeing of green, that experience of, what it's like when you see the color green, that's an experience that arises in the universe, but there is no green property out there. The thing we're seeing is inside. It's the felt experience. We can talk about how the light waves, certain wavelengths of light are bouncing off a leaf, and some are getting absorbed, and then they enter the retina and get processed by the brain. And that's how this experience of green materializes. But the fact that that experience is there, which is separate from anything else we can say about it. It's that felt experience, the internal experience of the system. And that's how I'm using the word consciousness. That's what I'm calling a mystery. I hope that answers.
Yeah. I once heard it articulated in this way by our mutual friend, Jack Kornfield. And I don't know if this is his phraseology or he was quoting somebody else, but the question was, how did we go from rocks on this planet to singing opera?
Yeah, that's a nice way of illustrating it, although computers could sing opera. You can imagine a version of singing opera or of music. When I play music over a Bluetooth speaker, I don't think there's an experience there. We can get into how far my thinking has gone and how I now have question marks about that. But, the way we typically experience the world, there's almost nothing you can imagine, behavior that you could see from the outside that we can't imagine happening without consciousness. It's almost like you only know it when you feel it. We only know it by our experience of it. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's one of the areas of questioning that got me to become more interested in this is the realization at some point, after many years of working with neuroscientists and many years of thinking about this, it had never really dawned on me that there is no way to know for sure about any conscious experience except the one you're having yourself. It's a unique thing about consciousness.
You are sort of hinting at the sharp end of the tip of the spear in terms of what you're exploring in this new audio doc. But before we get to that, let me ask this. Let me go back to the second part of the question, which is, who cares? Like, well, is this just a supremely academic exercise?
The only thing we actually know at all that is real and know firsthand is our conscious experiences. I mean, if you think of trying to name something that you care about, but it's something that you don't experience, that's not conscious. I mean, it actually doesn't even make sense to utter that phrase, right? So everything we experience by definition is a conscious experience. It is everything. So we could be, there could be many explanations for the universe and the structure of the universe. And I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with this thought experiment of a brain in a vat. Everything we think is true about the universe could be wrong, but the one thing we know is this experience I'm having right now is happening. Whatever is causing it, whatever the outside description of it is, when I touch this table, I know that experience of touch is happening. That's real. Whatever is causing it, whatever the outside reality is. In some sense, I think almost everyone is interested because it's the only thing. Everything that we're interested in takes place in our conscious awareness. And then beyond that, I think as a scientific investigation and question, it really does cross over into all of the areas of science. And then, to the extent that the general public is interested in black holes and understanding, more about our solar system and understanding more about how the brain works. And I think there's this innate curiosity that the vast majority of people have, where understanding our world better, especially something that relates so closely to our personal experience, is always just something we want. We want the full story on, or we want to know everything that the scientists know.
Yes to all of that. And I think what you explore in this audio doc is how investigating for ourselves the nature of consciousness can have some profound impacts on our experience of being alive and our happiness levels. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, and that's been a very interesting path for me personally, because I've been practicing meditation for 25 or so years now. My practice in meditation for the longest time did not actually seem relevant at all to my work in the sciences. At some point, I got very excited when the neuroscientists I was working with became interested in what's happening at the level of the brain in meditation. And so I'm sure you've talked about these a lot, there are all these fMRI studies. And so neuroscientists started to study people's brains during meditation. But that was the most crossover I ever thought there would be. And then, as you heard in my story in the documentary, at some point, these things started to completely overlap, where I realized there are certain experiences had in meditation that might actually inform the science beyond neuroscience. And that remains to be seen. I don't know. Suddenly, the work I was doing, the personal work I was doing, kind of the psychological and spiritual work I was doing with my meditation practice had all this crossover with the science I was studying. And so I was mentioning to you earlier that actually doing this work now kind of has a similar effect on me as my meditation practice used to, where it actually all feels more conducive to well-being. It feels like therapy when I'm going through a hard time. Focusing on these subjects, I'm finding that they all kind of point in the same direction in terms of human well-being. And that's interesting and unexpected.
How exactly is it like therapy for you specifically? And then how is it that they're all pointing toward human well-being?
I can loosely say that where most science, when you get deep enough in, whether you're talking about biology, neuroscience, physics, what you find kind of at this bottom layer of it all is that it's very clear. It's hard to find separations between things. There's a sense of oneness. There's a realization that we're all literally made of the same ingredients, that it's almost impossible to find boundaries between things. The most recent thing I was reading about with our microbiome and how, bacteria in our gut affect our brain. And it's once you look at the details, the more we learn about the underlying science, the more we realize this universe is one thing, and there are kind of these ever-changing fluctuations and evolutions and things arising and passing away, which is exactly what you realize. It's one of the main insights in a meditation practice is that is the truth of the universe. And so it's kind of these two very different ways of arriving at a truth that's not only satisfying because you have a deeper understanding, but it's a truth that is beautiful and awe-inspiring and kind of an antidote to most of our human suffering. And most of our human suffering comes from this feeling of separation. In the type of science that I've been involved with for this project, it continually comes back to this point that this is, in some sense, all one system taking on different forms.
That's beautiful. And it reminds me of this. I was on a retreat several years ago with this meditation teacher who I really love. Her name is Spring Washam, and she's been on the show many times. I'll put some links in the show notes. She's quite a character. And at one point during the retreat, she said, think about it like a beach. You have all of this sand. It's all the sand. But then one grain of sand says, no, I'm Janelle, and right. I'm not part of this. Yeah. And that's how the suffering begins.
Yes, that's right. I actually use the image of an ocean wave to talk about the illusion of self. I mentioned it a few times in the documentary and have just been using it more and more because I think it gets at that point very viscerally that, our experience of being a self is actually more like an ocean wave than a static object like a rock. And so the illusion is that there's something static inside of all of us that, moves throughout our life from moment to moment, that's unchanging and somehow separate from the rest of the world, not connected to the universe, completely isolated, and even after years of meditation practice and dropping this illusion a lot, I still, the intuition I have most of the time in my daily life is that I'm in here somewhere. And I'll talk about, my thoughts, my brain, my body, as if the my of that situation isn't all those things, is somehow separate from them. An ocean wave is an interesting thing to contemplate and look at because we can talk about, in the same way we can talk about the self and say useful things about it. We can talk about an ocean wave. We understand the phenomena. We can point them out. We can talk about how one wave's different from another. But there's no sense in which an ocean wave is a static thing. It's a phenomena in nature. It's a continually changing dance of molecules, right? And so that is closer to the truth of what our experience of self actually is and what our conscious experience actually is. It's just an ever-evolving, ever-changing, arising and passing away of conscious experiences. And there's no center to it. There's nothing that's separate from everything else. We're completely embedded in the universe and are part of the universe and not separate from nature, not separate from each other. We're kind of all part of this larger thing.
You are nature. Every embarrassing thought that skitters through your mind
yes,
is nature. Right. Okay, so we've given a tantalizing sense, I think, to listeners about how this can matter to them. And we'll come back and dwell in these things in more depth later. But let me get to the specific question that you're chasing in this documentary. And I'll see if I can frame it correctly, because I find that this subject kind of breaks my brain a little bit,
Yeah.
in a good way. So you had written a book and you came on the show to discuss it back in 2019, I believe, called Conscious. After writing that book, you started to have some conversations about an issue that you had touched on in the book but didn't fully explore. And it's the question of whether consciousness is fundamental, meaning, I think, that all matter in the universe has some degree of consciousness, which the listeners probably thinking, oh, is this chair know my butt's on it? Like what? Yeah, exactly. So can you just take it from there and also correct any mistakes I made?
Yeah. So, no, you didn't make any mistakes. I would just take one step in between, which is my first questions were more about, does consciousness go deeper in nature than the sciences, and myself included, had previously assumed? So, how far down can we take it? I mentioned worms and insects earlier. There's still debate among neuroscientists about whether worms and insects are conscious, even though they have brains and central nervous systems. But, once you grant that, then again, in my work and in science in general, the closer you look, the harder it is to find boundaries between things. And so my first exploration was just, how far down might this go? And how would we know? How could we prove or disprove this? And that in and of itself became fascinating because I realized there were all these questions I didn't know we had, and all these questions that no one has answers to. And that once you start to ask them, you realize that our intuitions about consciousness, many of them are wrong and turn out to be based on illusions. But most of them just have no evidence to support them. And so we're kind of relying on, even science has been relying on these very deep ingrained intuitions as if they're truth, as if we have evidence for them. And when you dig in, you realize we are actually just making an assumption based on everything we can sense and tell from our human experience. So the first question was just about, whether it can go deeper, and the fact that we are always relying on self-report. And so, there's this very interesting thing about language and how language relates to conscious experiences, and how, we can't share, you and I can't give you my conscious experience. I can explain it to you. And because we're such similar systems, you see green and I see green. And so we can all, we can talk about that pretty seamlessly. But, if you imagine trying to talk to someone who was born blind about something you're seeing, there is nothing you can say that will generate the experience for them. That experience isn't there. And so the more things like that you take away, the less you have in common, the less there's any ability to communicate, because we have to share the qualia. This is a philosophical term. Qualia is the type of conscious experience you're having. So the felt sensation I'm having right now when I do this on my fingertips, the experience of seeing blue, any quality of any type of experience we can have is called qualia, referred to as qualia. And there are other animals that have qualia that we don't have. So animals that experience the Earth's magnetic field, they're feeling something that we don't feel. They have a qualia that we don't have. And that's actually a good example for, certain animals, even if we could discover a common language, we couldn't talk to fish about the Earth's magnetic field and what that feels like and our intuitions about it, because you have to have the experience in order to be able to communicate about it. And so this became clearer and clearer to me as I did these investigations, realizing we have assumed that consciousness is a complex phenomenon in nature, because we are the most complex things we know of in the universe. The human brain is the most complex thing we know of in the universe. We're complex. We do all of these things. We're conscious. It's pretty obvious that all the humans around us are conscious. It's also obvious that the cats and dogs are conscious. And then the less like us a system is, the less we can have any behavior that tells us about conscious experience. And so I just started wondering, are there other, even, somewhat complex systems in nature that we have no common experiences with? If they're experiencing something, how would we ever know? And why have we assumed? So I actually talk about this. I've named this the strong assumption. And the strong assumption is what I'm talking about, that consciousness only arises in complex systems like human beings. or potentially AI that we might create one day, but something that is as complex as a human being. That's where consciousness arises. That's kind of the strong assumption out of really only two assumptions we can make. I just had this thought one day, if you're just standing and you're looking out at the universe and you're just a scientist and you want to figure out, okay, which of these systems that I'm observing have conscious experiences associated with them and which don't. And your starting point has to be broad. And the starting point either has to be some of them do or all of them do. We know it can't be none because we have evidence of our own conscious experiences. So conscious experiences exist in the universe. Of everything I can perceive, either some of them have conscious experiences or all of them do. And so we're so limited by the science at this stage that it makes perfect sense to begin with this assumption that only some do. And that's the only evidence we can acquire is from these, other systems like us, like other human beings. But I think it's important for scientists and the public at large to realize that is purely an assumption based on our limited access to information. And we could do science, especially at this point, and it's what I'm advocating for. We could conduct science with the other assumption, not getting rid of the first assumption we made, but starting with this other assumption. What if consciousness is actually a basic feature of the universe? What if it's more like gravity? And that doesn't mean it's not special or incredible, but we are just assuming that it arises out of complex processing, and we don't really have good evidence for that. And so there's this question about whether it's actually a very basic feature and whether very simple systems have very simple types of qualia that arise in them. And complex ones just have much more complex content arising. I started answering one question. I think I answered 4 other questions, but I'll stop and let you interject now.
It's all good. So are you saying, I'm going to ask a simplistic question. Are you saying that this microphone into which I'm speaking may have some degree of conscious experience?
I can't believe that my answer to that is yes, but the short answer to that is yes. But I would say that we are misled when we put it in those terms. And this is another place where the illusion of self becomes an obstacle. So we think of consciousness as being a self because that's how we experience consciousness. It's a little bit easier for experienced meditators who've dropped this illusion to follow me here. But, you can intellectually follow me even if you haven't had the experience. If consciousness is fundamental, there are conscious experiences arising in every point in space-time across the universe all the time. My best guess, based on the atoms that compose this microphone, there's nothing to suggest that it's a integrated system like a brain, that it would feel like a self, that there's even a microphone as it's like we can talk about human beings kind of as being one system. But the truth is, if consciousness is fundamental, there are many other conscious experiences arising in my brain and body right now that I am not aware of. So the I that I can report on is kind of a stream of memories that get created because of the way my brain works, right? So I have access to many different conscious experiences in the past because memory strings them along. But in the same way that, I've had many experiences that I don't remember, right? And so those are experiences that arose and passed away in the universe. And there may be a very minimal conscious experience that arises out of the processing that's happening in my liver, out of blood flow, out of cells connecting and disconnecting. If consciousness is fundamental, it truly is like an infinite number of experiences arising and passing away in each moment. And as you know, that actually is the truth of our own experience as well. There is no self that carries the experiences along. What we have is memory. Memory is a huge part of what creates the illusion of self, because even though we are more like waves, our conscious experience is more like waves in that things are coming into and out of being. Some of the things that come into being are other conscious experiences from the past. So we have, it's interesting to think about in this other way that we are connected to our previous selves. Like if you think of yourself as a 5-year-old kid, right? I mean, the truth is physically, your brain is probably more similar to my brain right now than it is to your brain at 5 years old. But you have this connection through time to this other person at this other time and its other place and time and space, because memory has given the conscious experience you're having now access to conscious experiences that happened to that person a long time ago. And conscious experiences can't be shared in the same moment, but they can be shared across time. And we can get into some crazy thought experiments I've been having about, maybe future technologies will actually change this. I think it's not unlikely that in the future there will be technology that potentially gives us an ability to share conscious experiences, not perfectly, but your memory of your 5-year-old self isn't perfect either. So, but in that same way that you can conjure up an experience of being yourself many years ago, you have that memory, you broke your knee and the pain of that experience. In the same way that you have access to that, we might be able to live in a future where you could have access to my experience right now of looking at you from over here. I think that type of thing will really help dispel this illusion of self. But yeah, that's another rabbit hole.
I think it's a part of the plot of Jennifer Egan's book, The Candy House, right? I might be. You didn't read it?
I don't know it.
Okay. Jennifer Egan.
I'm going to write it down, actually.
Yeah, she wrote a book. She's been on the show, too. I'll drop a link to that. And
Oh, yeah. Oh, great.
She wrote A Visit from the Goon Squad, which I believe won a Pulitzer. And then she wrote a later book. I think it's called The Candy House or something. I'm probably screwing it up. But part of it, one of the people in the book invents this technology where you can experience other people's consciousness. Okay, so let's just go back to some of the points you made earlier.
Okay.
When you're talking about consciousness is fundamental, you are saying this far out thing that, yes, there may be some level of consciousness experience in the table I'm leaning on right now, the chair I'm sitting in, the microphone I'm speaking into. It's not consciousness the way we as complex systems would experience consciousness, where we experience it as a self who's existed through time, which again is an illusion, but it's still.
I don't think there's any experience of being the microphone.
Yes.
I think that wouldn't make sense. Yeah.
And one of your interviewees in the audio documentary talks about this, and he uses it because this is a guy, the scientist you're talking to, has done no small amount of Buddhist practice, and he talks about the fact that some of these what we would call inanimate objects have what a Buddhist might call bare awareness, meaning that there's just some raw knowing faculty available without unhindered by this sense of self or emotion. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my guess is, and the way I view things now, but this is jumping a lot of steps, is that anywhere we're perceiving mass, structure, things in the universe, that is kind of a warping or shaping of consciousness, so that there would be some kind of content, and that consciousness is kind of what everything actually is at bottom. That consciousness is what the universe is made of. And so, if there is something like pure consciousness, we wouldn't, if we're perceiving something, that's not where we would find it. It's probably much closer to that. But I think wherever we see matter, that is, we're perceiving. I often use the analogy to space-time. So, Einstein gave us this incredibly brilliant, new way of viewing the situation we're in, which is that gravity is not a force in the way we used to think about it, but it's a warping of space-time, that there's kind of this fabric of space-time and it gets warped, and that explains how things move. And why mass, changes the shape of space-time and then changes the direction of objects. And so if consciousness is fundamental, for some reason, it takes these different shapes and forms and causes all of these different types of qualia to arise. What we are perceiving when we perceive anything, a pencil, a tree, even sound waves, that to me, my guess is that's part of the structure of some type of warping that is causing these experiences to happen. And that if there is truly something in the universe that is bare awareness or pure consciousness, that is kind of the fundamental stuff. That's what consciousness is. And then content arises when it takes these different shapes and forms.
Okay, so let me represent the listener here for a second. If it's true that consciousness is fundamental, what does that have to do with my life?
Yeah. So in many ways, nothing. I think it's like many other paradigm shifts. So you could say the same thing about Einstein's discoveries and intuitions. What does it matter to me that it's not 3 dimensions of space and then, time is this other thing? These paradigm shifts, I think, truly end up affecting everyone because they change they almost literally change the universe we live in, right? So if you imagine living 300 years ago, that like every time we get new information, we feel different in the world. We don't feel like we live on a flat earth. We don't feel like, and of course, most of the time these things aren't relevant. But I think in the big picture they are, and they kind of seep into the way we live our lives. It's also, I think, many of these scientific truths are a source of awe and inspiration for so many people. So it is getting out of your daily life and lying out on a field and looking at the stars at night that gives you that feeling of awe, partly because you know that the vast universe is out there and you have a sense, the more we understand about the situation we're in many ways, the more awe-inspiring things become. And so in the same way that I think everyone would want to know the truth of our situation, that we're orbiting the sun and this is how things work. And there are these things called black holes that we don't understand and don't affect my everyday life. But what is that? And how is it possible that light disappears and we don't understand how things work in those zones in the universe? If it's true that consciousness is fundamental, and I really don't know, and I'm not claiming that it is, I think it's a valid path of inquiry, scientific inquiry. But if we become more and more convinced that that is the case, to the point where we think it's more likely than not, that is a completely paradigm shifting thing. And if you can, I now spend a lot of my time doing this, running through these thought experiments. But if you just think about the fact that we now understand that everything you see, everything, not just the people, not just the dogs and the cats, not just the mice, but everything you perceive in the world is actually a representation of conscious experiences. I think that changes the way we live our lives. I think it changes how we think about ethics. I think there are things we couldn't even possibly imagine now that it will change about the way we feel and behave and conduct science and all the rest. I think will also just lead to many new discoveries because we haven't gone down that path. And so I think once some really brilliant scientific minds start with this assumption and see where it leads, it's like anything else, like any other scientific discovery. The discovery comes first, and then it leads to all these things that you never could have dreamed. And so, yeah, I guess that's a further point in how it's not necessarily relevant now, but eventually this becomes relevant for our everyday lives because, the discovery of quantum mechanics gives us quantum computing. They're just these inevitable, once you learn more about how the universe works, they're just these inevitable, new ideas and technologies and sciences that come out of it. So I find it very exciting to imagine this paradigm shift happening.
Well said. So yes, I can imagine that it would matter to us because, as you said, because it could lead to scientific developments that would have everyday implications. But there is even just at the level of the mind, and I think this is probably available now to most of us, this contemplation of. I was thinking about a friend was telling me about another friend who had taken some psilocybin out of, eaten some chocolate with a little bit of mushrooms in them and just a microdose. And she was sitting in her backyard and all of a sudden felt like, oh, yeah, the trees are breathing back at me. And so if you're lying, just to go back to the scenario you posited earlier, you're lying on the ground on a summer night and you're looking up at the stars, to think that what you're lying on and what you're looking at, it all has some level of experience to it.
Beyond that, even that's what actually everything is at bottom. The things we perceive as being out there, the atoms and the ways that they appear to us in our conscious awareness, are actually not things in the way we think of them at all. They are our view on other conscious experiences, that's all there really is. And yes, I think there's something very profound. I think it significantly shifts the way we feel in the world, and I would say for the better, for the most part. And so I would actually invite your listeners to just run that thought experiment. You don't have to believe it, but just spend a little bit of time. Kind of, I walk the listener in my documentary through this process of an experience I had of when I was going for a jog, and I'm around a lot of people and birds, and I just started letting my intuition for understanding that other conscious experiences exist in the joggers around me, and the dogs, and the mice, and then maybe the ants, and then I kind of let that intuitive understanding I have that there are these other, the truth is, even doing that, like we're usually so stuck in our own experience that it's funny that it's almost surprising to us that other people are having their own conscious experiences, right? Like, it's amazing that it's surprising to us, even to someone like me who thinks about this all the time. And actually, it's the way I'm getting a little off topic. Oops, I'm getting a little off topic, but I'll come back. But I love, my daughters often have this experience where it's a little bit of like a spiritual epiphany where, and I think it's in moments when they're really connected. And I've noticed this too. This happens to me with Sam sometimes, or close friends when we get connected. You feel like you're sharing a moment. You feel so connected that you're in this moment together. And then you realize, but wait, they're in this perspective. They're over there having this experience with me. Like, that's not my experience at all. Anyway, I think it's spiritually, useful. It's useful for our well-being to actually focus on this anyway, the places where we know conscious experiences exist, to just kind of be in the world and realize these lights are on all around us. These kind of this ineffable and mysterious and beautiful light of consciousness, this experience I'm having, that there are many of them all around me. And there's something, I think, quite beautiful about that. But then, yeah, you can kind of let that, the deeper you let that sink in, I think the more of that feeling starts to overcome you. And I think it's interesting just to see how would you feel if you knew that you can let that thought experiment you're doing with the cats and the dogs, assuming they're all having their experience, probably something you can hardly imagine what it's like to be a dog, what it's like to be a mouse, what it's like to be an ant. And then suddenly it's grass and trees and plants and flowers and the earth. And, it's all just teeming with this sense of being. I think it's a pretty big shift.
Meditation is not just a quick fix. It is a practice to change all parts of your life, and you don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. The Happier Meditation app meets you where you are, so you can realize more than you thought possible with a flexible approach that grows with you and wisdom from some of the world's most insightful teachers. Happier helps you get more out of meditation so you can give more to every part of your life. Go to happierapp.com and start meditating in a way that truly fits you. My mind's going in two directions with this. One is at the shallower level, not that any of this is shallow, but on the easier to access level, just thinking about other people's consciousness experience, never mind the conscious experience of a blade of grass, is kind of pushes you in a Copernican direction. Like, you're no longer the center of the universe. Like there are lots of centers. There's no center. And then the other thing that's coming to mind is, I interviewed a few months ago Sebastian Younger, and I know Sam on the Waking Up app also interviewed Sebastian, who's a journalist and had this near-death experience. And
I've been in touch with him about this, actually.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah.
And so one of the things he was saying, and this is me summarizing his non-scientific summary of what scientists actually think, so this is probably a lot that's going to get lost in this translation, but roughly speaking, the idea, it's funny, in spiritual circles, you sometimes hear people referring to source energy, like the source, and that always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, just because it sounded highfalutin. But like if or just kind of, I don't know, it just felt off to me. And yet I I think what Sebastian was saying, and you'll correct me slash him, is that there's an intuition among scientists that there may just be one bucket of consciousness that we're all getting a share of. And so that goes right to oneness and not being isolated and separate and lonely in this world, navigating a cold, indifferent universe.
Yes. No, I think you said it well. I think that's right. I mean, I frame it a little differently, but no, I think that is the takeaway. If consciousness is fundamental, I think we always have to be careful to not anthropomorphize it, especially with the experience of self, because for most people, I mean, I even can fall into this. I have to kind of keep breaking my intuition so that I can think clearly. For most of us, we almost feel like self and consciousness are the same thing. So when we imagine consciousness being pervasive, it's very hard for us to do that without adding a self. And this is where, I have to be very careful with my terminology. And I also have to be careful to be clear that I'm not advocating a whole wide range of New Age claims that have some crossover here. Because I'm really coming at it from a scientific standpoint of this is something we truly don't understand. And there's this other option that we haven't yet investigated and we don't know. But I think we need to think very carefully if we're moving forward with an assumption that consciousness is fundamental. And what does that mean about the universe? What does that mean about the physics and the math that we see around us? I've been using two analogies. I often use the analogy of a pot of boiling water. Where water is the fundamental stuff. Well, everything is essentially water, and the bubbles represent different conscious experiences arising and passing away. And it's not that water has a mind or a personality or, anything like what we experience, right? It's just that the answer to the question, when you break things apart and you get to the atoms and you get to the quarks and you get to the bottom of everything, what is this stuff? What is the stuff of the universe? And the answer to that, if consciousness is fundamental, is the stuff we perceive isn't stuff out there. It is how one conscious experience affects another conscious experience. And so it's these molding of qualia and felt experiences that arise. And again, I'll go back to this analogy of seeing green, because I think it's useful here too, where in the same way that we feel that green is something that's out there, and scientists fell for this for a long time too. Now, scientists understand what the mechanism is that causes us to see green, and that there's no greenness out there in the universe. Our intuitions are very hard to get past there, right? Like especially if we're just human beings without a lot of science trying to, I see green, you see green, we can all talk about green, like the leaf is green and there's a green leaf and it's right there and I know it's there, right? When in fact, it is how my brain responds to light waves that come in this direction and get processed and so on. And so, it's interesting where fundamental physics is headed now. Most physicists are on the same page about agreeing that space is not fundamental, that space is something that's emergent. So I've been thinking a lot about this lately too, to help kind of rattle my intuitions. Is it possible that there's an analogy to the seeing green with space, where space isn't even something that is real? There's no space out there. Our brains are mapping something where we're getting a sense of the structure of reality, but is it more like energy frequencies? And George Musser, who I interview for the series, speaks about this beautifully and gives an analogy about music and about I won't go into the details there, but that's in the chapter on space and time. But he gives a really interesting ways of conceiving of how it's possible space is not space in the way that green is not green. And it is our experience of something that we're interacting with. And it's a very good approximation of a map of whatever our brain is mapping for us. But the idea that space is a real thing, the way we perceive it, I think is very likely false. This actually comes back to a question you had earlier, which is how insights in meditation might inform science. And I want to be very careful here too, because I think there's no reason to believe that any insight you have in meditation is necessarily a scientific insight. I think, it's interesting to me because there are a few key insights in meditation that have been had over and over and over again that clearly map on to what we understand about the physics of things. And so I think it's possible that there are ways to get a clearer sense of reality and it actually is a great tool for breaking intuitions. Seeing through the illusion of self, having experience that is spaceless and timeless. I think there's a way in which meditation breaks our evolved patterns that have evolved to keep us alive, but have not necessarily evolved to get us to see the truth clearly. That it's possible that meditation can be used as a tool in some cases to gain deeper insights about the true nature of reality, largely because it's short-circuiting all of these evolved tools that actually create illusions for us that are useful for our everyday lives, but that create illusions in terms of being able to see the underlying reality clearly.
Oh, so many things I want to talk about. You brought me right to where
Sorry.
I was hoping to get, which is, I think we should talk about some of the practical meditation things we can do to help us, knock on this door ourselves or really explore this mystery. But let me just pick up on the evolution thing, because I sometimes think about how evolution bequeathed us these minds that kept us alive, but kept us unhappy. Because in order to stay alive, we needed to constantly be in a state of anxiety and desire.
Yes.
And so what's called for now at this moment in human history, when we have these ancient brains wielding these very modern weapons in terms of nukes and AI and bioweapons and whatever, and never mind the climate crisis, what's called for now is kind of the next step in evolution, which is, in my view, to be able to see through some of the illusions with which we've been wired so that we can do smarter shit going forward. Does that all land for you?
Yes, it does. I actually talked to Joseph Goldstein, who is our mutual friend, but I spoke to him a few times for my documentary series. And one thing is one of my favorite parts of our conversation is he said that he had a conversation with another friend of his once talking about how meditation is essentially going against evolution.
Yes.
If you really follow your meditation practice perfectly, you won't eat or, you won't do any of the things that are going to keep you alive. And that also makes sense. We are entropy fighting machines. And in order to fight entropy, it takes energy. And that is, inherent in that is competition and pain and injury and death and desire, and all the sources of suffering are just part of the energy and structure it takes to maintain life. And so, this is something I struggle with in my own practice, really, is just finding this balance of not leaving this world completely and finding a way to be in it with the wisdom that can be gained from seeing how much it all is just a suffering generating machine, really.
The spiritual traditions do have an answer to this, which is that it's a balance, that two things are true at the same time. One is that at the level of subatomic particles, it's, mostly this chair isn't really a chair. It's just empty, particles spinning in empty space. And the same is true of yourself.
Yes.
Like if you look for Annaka behind your eyes, you won't find some homunculus of Annaka. It's all just conscious experiences arising and passing away in the present moment. And so it's a mistake. That's all true, but it would be a mistake to say, to arrive at a nihilistic conclusion that none of this matters, because it is also true that on the day-to-day level, you are Annaka and I am Dan, and I should be nice to you.
Yes.
We
and
should.
A lot of the happiness and well-being depends on, how we use these systems.
In some of the famous Buddhist art over time, the final stages of enlightenment include a return to the marketplace, that we can have these big insights into the nature of reality, but it's not that none of it matters.
No, and they help relieve the suffering that
yes,
exists, that is inherent. Yeah.
the suffering that prevents you from being useful.
That prevents you from being
Useful, from
useful.
being in the marketplace or sort of in the world as a useful, helpful human being.
This interestingly dovetails with Donald Hoffman's work. So Donald Hoffman wrote a book and also has a great TED Talk on this subject, where he argues that evolution actually works to hide the truth from us. The more evolved a system is, the better at survival it is, the less it sees the truth of the underlying reality. Of course, it sees the truth of how to survive. But the better you are at surviving, the less you are able to see the truth, which makes a lot of sense. And his work is really worth checking out. So I had just had a conversation with Donald Hoffman when I then had that conversation with Joseph, and it made clearer for me why meditation can actually be such a useful tool for scientists, especially scientists interested in fundamental science and in consciousness, because we can use it as our tool to break through all of the intuitions we have evolved that make us think, for instance, that there is green out there in the universe, right? So a lot of scientific breakthroughs and paradigm shifts cause us to, I would say probably all the ones I can think of, cause us to shift our intuitions or shatter an intuition we have. And I think that the cool thing is that we are able to shift our intuitions, we're able to remold them. And so through understanding, I still, on a day-to-day basis, feel like green is out there in the world, but I feel differently about it now that I understand the mechanics of how that happens than I did when I didn't understand that. In my series, I talk about the germ theory of disease and how intuition shattering that was for people. I mean, and this goes again back to how we almost live in a different world after we have new information about it. You know, people used to live in a world that did not include microscopic things. We didn't know they existed. We didn't know that's how people got sick. There were many theories about how people got sick. It was confusing. We were trying to figure it out. Then this theory came along, and eventually we have microscopes and we can actually see them for ourselves. But after that invention and after the acceptance of this scientific breakthrough, we now live in a new world where there are microscopic things that we can pass to each other through the air that we can't see or feel or taste or touch that can make us sick and ultimately kill us. These harmful things that are invisible. Meditation can be used to further that process, and in some cases, I think to begin that process of breaking through the intuition that is preventing us from seeing a deeper truth. And I can give a couple of examples if that's helpful. But
yeah, but self is an
okay. So self is an obvious one. It can break through intuitions, I think, in a way that doesn't necessarily give us true information, but is just useful to break the intuition. So the fact that people can have an experience of a spaceless, timeless form of consciousness, it turns out that space is very likely not fundamental. And so that is kind of an insight into a truer version of the situation we're in. But even if that weren't true, I think being able to sit in an experience of no space and no time opens up your ability to think creatively about how the universe works in a way that is almost impossible when you're stuck in these evolved intuitions. And I think the same is true for psychedelics. It so drastically changes the way we experience the world that it gets you to realize how different things could be. So for someone like Einstein to be able to think about the universe and to think about the forces we understand and to reframe the whole thing as not that large, massive bodies are like magnets pulling things in, but that the fabric of space-time is curving and things are falling towards it. You have to, he was gifted with this incredibly creative and brilliant mind, but part of what that brilliance and creativity came out of is an ability to let go of the way we typically experience things, to not trust that the way we experience things in a day-to-day way is the true way things are. Yeah, I think that that's my answer to how meditation can be scientifically useful. I mean, I think there also are now some insights that we know which are in fact truer.
I'm just slightly stressed because we don't have that much time, and what I keep wanting to drive us to
I forgot we had to end.
What I keep wanting to drive us to is like actual practices people can do to help them like experience this in way. And by this, I mean the illusion of the self, the nature of consciousness in ways that will improve their actual lives. The philosophical aspect of all this is super interesting.
Yeah.
And, you know, the nature of this show is, as my producer says, we are relentlessly practical. So, and you've also, I know you posted on your blog for a while ago, years ago, the some of Joseph's exercises for looking at like, what is a thought? Or so anything that comes to mind that that can help us experience this for ourselves and see the liberative potential of seeing through this illusion.
Regular meditation practice is really all it's about. And I will say, I'm sure your listeners have heard this a million times, but I will say sitting a meditation retreat, the reason I made you sit a meditation retreat is because I do believe there's something that we don't yet understand at the level of the brain about spending that kind of time. I think it's very different from even if you practice an hour a day for years and years. I think there's a different shift that happens that's very likely physical at the level of the brain when you commit to just days of the practice all together in one go. I know that that's where I've had my biggest shifts and insights have been on meditation retreats. So I cannot recommend that highly enough. I force as many of my friends as will let me to sit a retreat.
I remember there was a time when you and the girls were at our apartment back when we lived in New York City, and we were talking about meditation retreats. And I asked your older daughter, would you be okay if mommy went on a meditation retreat? She said, no, she can't leave it. I said, what about daddy? She's like, oh yeah, he can go.
Yeah, fine. I have sat some retreats now since I had children, but it's definitely harder. But I'm so grateful actually for those long ones I had before I had children, because those feel like permanent changes. I don't quite understand how that's possible, and I'm not the only one who says this, but it feels like a permanent, lasting change, those shifts that happen on retreat. Even after a year, I didn't go on retreat probably for 10 years after we had kids. Those shifts and insights remained stable. So I think there's something really to be said for many days at a time of practicing.
For sure. One thing that works for me, and I just want to run this by you, in terms of being able to experience, a very sort of accessible level to me, that not every this doesn't work for every mind, so I'll just say it out loud. But there's this kind of progression that I do in my meditation practice, and it's particularly when I'm doing walking meditations, so my eyes are open, and this is a Joseph Goldstein technique, where I will use the passive voice. So seeing is being known, or hot or cold is being known, pressure is being known. And then you ask, by what? Mm-hmm. And you don't have to look too hard. Just like simply, what is knowing all of this? I know I'm seeing a bunch of stuff right now. I know I'm hearing my own voice, which is slightly grating. But who is taking delivery of those packages? And the not finding is the finding.
Yeah, it's interesting that works for me now. Before I had the insight myself, that type of instruction was not helpful to me. Mm-hmm. So maybe I can help the listeners who don't find that helpful.
And I think there are a lot.
Yeah, because for me, and I don't know if it has to do with how active an imagination someone has, but when I would look, I would see the image that would come up for me is an image of myself. So I found it, and it almost went again, like it was almost bad for my practice because it was pushing me more into the feeling of self. Mm. It was just bringing back the illusion for me. It was kind of accentuating the illusion in a sense. The first thing that really worked for me was Harding's work on having no head. I think that's
Great
the
book.
name of his book.
Yeah, the book is called On Having No Head.
And before I even read the book, just hearing the title of the book was hugely transformative to me because in my meditation practice, I just kind of took the advice from the title, like imagine you have no head. And that was almost instantaneous for me. So I recommend that to people who have a hard time looking for the looker, and that doesn't really shift their feeling at all. Dropping, if for me, it feels more of an experiential practice in the moment of the idea of your head is also an idea. And so you can reframe the way you imagine yourself to be in the world. And when you drop that, to me, that does something really interesting. It just shows me the truth immediately. So I would highly recommend reading that book and trying that practice.
That's what did it for me.
On having no head?
Yeah, your husband recommended it to me, and then I brought it with me on a meditation retreat. The thing about this is that, and Sam is really good in his guided meditations on this, like, don't, and he writes about this in his book, also called Waking Up, like, don't look too hard because it's actually right there on the surface. And don't expect white lights. It's and like string music. It's not that kind of insight. It's like just super obvious
just like
and
obvious.
Right there. Yes.
The other thing I was going to say, actually, before you mentioned that practice and dropping of self at all as an intention or goal of some sort, one practice that I used to do kind of intuitively and spontaneously before I learned formal meditation practice, I think when I was just purely in this mode of being intensely curious about consciousness and what we are, what our place is in the universe. What spontaneously came to me was imagining that I was just floating in outer space, coming into being for the first time. So trying to let go, just start with the bare minimum. And anytime I had a concept, so like, I'd have a sensation in my right hand. And, when I first started this practice, I'd imagine then I would kind of like see in my mind's eye a right hand, right? Like then I'm in a body again. And I try to, every time that happened, I try to drop it and just be like, no, what is that? What is that sensation actually? Because it doesn't feel like a hand. It feels like what is it? It's a kind of pressure. And where in space is it? It's not so clear. And the more time you spend just on your perceptions, imagining you're just this being that's, almost like a brain in a vat that's kind of just being connected one module at a time. I'm actually realizing now I did a version of this in my book, kind of walking the reader through this type of thinking. But I find this to be a very useful meditation practice of just try to drop all of it. And you're just born now as this, conscious being, maybe no body, just outer space. And then what are those feelings, and do they happen in space it can really get you to feel like consciousness is kind of all over, and it takes on these different forms, and you can really lose the sense of having a body and then therefore a self. And again, I think because our only direct contact with reality is through our conscious experience, is through our felt experience. The rest of it is just kind of ideas that we map onto it. And many of them are incorrect or based on illusions. And so I think getting closer to what the actual experience is, clears the mind in a way and opens us up for different ways of thinking about our circumstance.
I do want to say to the listener that, these practices where you're kind of gently putting the sense of self through a cheese grater and it's so that you're not so stuck in your own head. For many people, it can just take a while, and just don't get sweaty about it. Try it out. Be gentle. If it's not working, back off and do your quote unquote regular meditation practice where you're watching the breath. And then every time you get distracted, you start again. It comes for some people slowly. It comes for some people quickly. It's just play with it.
I agree with all of that. And I would say coming from a place of curiosity rather than having a goal really covers everything because, and that is, I'm lucky that that's kind of where I started with my interest in all of this. You and I talked about this the last time we spoke, that the first time I really found myself doing what was essentially a meditation practice was when I was young and having incredibly intense migraine. So I was in severe pain as a child and just forced to sit and be with the pain. There's something about getting curious. It's a incredibly, even for just a science-minded person, the scientist in me finds this practice so interesting. Forget about whatever goal I might get to. Just like I said, you're in outer space. This is your first experience. What is the experience? We so rarely do this, but it's pretty wild to realize everything is so amorphous. It's actually hard to grab on. It's hard to know what a sound even is, what a feeling of pain is, I love to focus on the more amorphous emotions too. Like touch is more concrete, sight, hearing is more concrete. But when you think about the moment you feel hungry in meditation, what is hunger? Like how do you know what hunger is? It's really interesting. And so just from a scientific, curious human perspective, it's a great practice to kind of let go of all of the goals and just say, I want to understand my experience better. I want to know what these things actually are. I think I know what they are, but when I look at them, they're more interesting than I thought.
Yes.
And actually, I have a conversation with Susan Blackmore in the chapter on meditation, and she wrote a book called 10 Zen Questions, and that's mostly what we talk about in my conversation with her. But she talks about sitting a minute. This book, 10 Zen Questions, is essentially created out of her journal on a Zen meditation retreat. And she talks about her interest really coming from a scientific perspective. She went in kind of as a scientist with this journal, just wanting, and she writes about consciousness. She wrote a textbook about consciousness. She is a neuroscientist, is very interested in the mind and the brain, and just went on this retreat with open curiosity. Like, I know that what I think I experience isn't exactly what I'm really experiencing, and I want to know what I'm really experiencing. Yeah. Anyway, her book is great for that. But I think it's just a great way to approach a meditation practice because there's no way to fail.
Exactly. Well, last question I want to ask you, and I think it's related, which is the value of challenging your intuitions. Now, we've talked about it within the context of consciousness being fundamental, possibly, but just as a life practice, how do we do it and what's the value?
I mean, I actually am noticing as you say that, I want to give one disclaimer, which is that we have a lot of incredibly useful intuitions. And I spend a lot of time actually talking about how unconscious processing gives us intuitions in circumstances where we might be in danger. And so, there's a whole realm of situations where you want to follow your intuitions because they're probably picking up on all kinds of unconscious cues that are giving you good information about the world. And, one circumstance can be you feel like you're in a dangerous situation, but you can't point to why. And so you kind of shrug it off, but it turns out you were noticing all kinds of cues from the environment you weren't aware of. And so there's that side of honoring your intuitions and using them the way they're meant to be used and listening to them when they're useful. But I guess it's also part of it is just understanding that an intuition, all it is really is a feeling that something is true, a strong feeling that something is true, like you know the truth, but not knowing why, not having the answers, not having the logical reasoning behind it. So, in the case of a dangerous situation, your body may be even adrenalized. You can feel like I am in a dangerous situation, but you just consciously, you have nothing to point to. It may be true, it may not be true. And so there, on the useful side of breaking intuitions and shattering intuitions and messing with them, that's kind of more on, not on the survival side of things, but more just on the how we perceive the world around us. And I think it's incredibly interesting on many levels how the things we feel are true in any given moment. And this can be relationship-wise. This can be a feeling about how you're being perceived by someone else, all the way down to, feeling like I'm on a flat earth and the sun rises. The sun is the thing that's moving and rises and sets, and getting understanding a deeper truth so that you can be more in touch with the reality of your situation. I think it's useful to always be open to the fact that the things that seem to be true may have a different reality when you look closer.
Yeah, and this could be true at a very mundane level of like, yeah, that guy's an asshole, or I don't like this, and I've never liked plums or whatever. It's
Sure.
about not being so locked in your certainties and biases.
Yeah. Yeah. Did we cover everything you wanted to cover?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay,
Thank you for bearing with me. Yeah. Thanks for producing this audio documentary. It's really cool. And thanks for making time to come on here and talk about it. I really appreciate it. But just remind everybody again, please, of the name of the audio documentary and where people can get it.
So the audio documentary is called Lights On. It's available to purchase as an audiobook. So wherever you buy audiobooks, on Spotify, on Audible, on Apple.
Also, and I'll put links to all of this, including the audio book / documentary in the show notes, but your website, socials, what else are you putting out there that if we want to follow you?
Lights On, the audio documentary, can be purchased wherever you purchase audiobooks. You can also get more information about it on my website, which is just my name, annakaharris.com. You can also go to lightsondocumentary.com, and that will take you to information about the series. We also have, the way you would for a podcast, we have show notes, chapter notes for every chapter. And so there are a lot of links to the relevant science and information for listeners who want to go deeper.
And I will say, Annaka has guided meditations, including guided meditations for kids and also some loving kindness meditation on the Waking Up app.
Yes.
Well, it was great to talk to you. It's a pleasure.
Thank
always.
you.